Our scripture reading this morning is taken from Matthew's Gospel. We are reading the story of what we know as the wise men, the first 12 verses of the second chapter of Matthew, Matthew 2, 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." And when King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." And then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." And when they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. And may God bless to our understanding in this reading of God's holy word. There are so many different aspects of the almost completed season that make it feel like Christmas. We all have our favorite sights, sounds, and smells that put us in the Christmas spirit and fill us with Christmas cheer. For me, it never really feels like Christmas until I hear someone say, "It just doesn't feel like Christmas this year." And knowing that about me, our son Drew, in early December, always calls me and says, "Dad, it just doesn't feel like Christmas this year," knowing that that will finally put me into the Christmas spirit. As we come near the end of this season, I find that I also need the story of the wise men to complete Christmas for me. Now, this isn't the gospel lectionary reading for this, the second Sunday after Christmas, but for all 3 years of the lectionary, it is the gospel reading for Epiphany, the 6th of January. And since this is the Sunday prior to that day, this becomes Epiphany Sunday. Now, there have been years here when we haven't used this story on Epiphany Sunday, but very few of them. And I realize that in those years when we haven't used this story, I feel as though we haven't really completed the season. We think of our 3 hymns for today as Christmas hymns, and yet they are really meant for Epiphany. And one that we aren't using, We Three Kings, is another Epiphany hymn that we ordinarily associate with Christmas. And the first question that may raise for many of you is, what in the world is Epiphany? Well, it's simply the day that we set aside to celebrate the visit of the wise men to Jesus. It's a word that basically means manifestation or revelation. And that's the way we use it now in our everyday speech. When someone says, "I had an epiphany last night," what they mean is, I had a new revelation. We call it an aha moment. And I think it's interesting that in this story, there's an epiphany, an aha moment for the wise men. But as we read this story, there is one for us as well. The epiphany for the wise men is related to what they did. And for that reason, it would probably be a good idea to call them what they were, or what Matthew calls them, magi. That's the word that is used here, that we, New Revised Standard Version, in the King James Version, translate as wise men. It's magi. Now, magi were astrologers, and they may have been wise, but they most certainly were not kings. And therefore, the epiphany they experienced was in looking into the nighttime sky and seeing something that they had not seen before, that told them something special was about to happen. Someone special was about to be born. And I think that's different than our epiphany, our aha moment in reading this story. It's certainly related to it, though. Our aha should come in realizing who these guys were, or weren't. And we can start with a very fundamental issue in what I just said. Who these guys were. Now again, Matthew simply calls them magi. He doesn't call them wise men. He doesn't call them kings. And there is no gender attached to magi. So who knows? Maybe it was a group of wise women, or queens, or princesses who traveled to see the Christ child. Now that's a bit unsettling, isn't it? And yet I think that is the point of the epiphany that we are called to experience with this story. We have trouble figuring out exactly what the point is to the story that only Matthew tells. I recently read about a little boy's understanding of the wise men, which offers an interesting take on this story. This boy had returned from Sunday school one day with a new perspective on the wise men from the east who brought gifts to the Christ child. And he was so excited that he just had to tell his friends, and he gathered them all together, and he said, today in Sunday school I learned all about the very first Christmas. You see, there wasn't a Santa way back then, so these three skinny guys on camels had to deliver all the toys. That's probably a perspective on the Magi that you hadn't heard before. But I think Matthew wants us to experience our own epiphany as we read of the Magi. He wants us to see something that is completely outside our normal way of looking at things. Now, when we look at Luke's Gospel, Luke tells us that the first ones to hear of the birth of the Messiah were lowly shepherds. Now, that certainly gives us a different perspective on who the message of Christ was meant for. But Matthew takes it even a step further. For at least the shepherds were nearby. At least the shepherds were fellow countrymen, and most likely they were people of the same faith. But not the Magi. Now the Magi were as far could be away from the land and the faith of the Jews. Now they weren't from the east, as in Newburgh or in Louisville or even in Boston. They were, for that time, on the complete other side of the world. And not only were they not Jews, that they were people who looked to the sky for spiritual guidance. That they didn't read the Bible to discover God's truth. They read the stars. See, the Magi were pagans. The Old Testament and the New Testament as well forbids astrology as an abomination. And yet here, Matthew portrays them as the good guys. good gals. You see, the point Matthew is trying to make is a point that he makes at various other places throughout his gospel. And then he keeps coming back to it again and again throughout his entire gospel. He tells about a Canaanite woman, a non-Jewish foreigner, who came to Jesus seeking desperate help for her child. And Jesus says to her rather coldly, I came from the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not for foreign dogs like you. And yet she catches him with her reply, but Lord, even the dogs are allowed the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And Jesus responds, oh woman, great is your faith. A Canaanite woman, a foreigner. Great is your faith, Jesus says. At another point, Matthew tells of a centurion who approaches Jesus because he has a servant who's been paralyzed. Now, this man won't dare to invite Jesus to his home because he knows that Jews aren't allowed to be in such close contact with Gentiles. And so he says to Jesus, only say the word, and I know my servant will be healed. And Jesus says to him, truly I tell you, nowhere in Israel have I found such faith. A Gentile with more faith than any Jew Jesus has ever seen. And then there was the centurion on watch at the crucifixion of Jesus who proclaimed, truly this man was the Son of God. You see, throughout his entire gospel, Matthew is trying to help us understand this message that he proclaims at the outset. He wants us to grasp the point. He wants us to get it. He wants us to have an epiphany. He wants us to have an aha moment of clarity when we realize that God's revelation is not limited to any one nation or any one religion or any one people. You see, I think we have the same trouble with this that Herod did. Now, when the Magi approached Herod, they asked, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? And Matthew tells us that when King Herod heard this, he was frightened. Herod was filled with Christmas fear. That's a world away from what we expect out of Christmas. But we think not of Christmas fear, but of Christmas cheer. We think of family and friends, presents and parties. We think of giving and sharing. We think of words of Advent, hope, peace, joy, and love. We think good thoughts. We think happy thoughts. We think of things that bring us Christmas cheer. Here was Herod, and the news of the birth of Jesus brought him nothing but Christmas fear. Matthew tells us that not only was Herod frightened, but all Jerusalem with him. Now, of course, all Jerusalem would have been frightened, for after all, Herod was a madman. No, on occasion he had done good things for the people, but he was powerful and he was paranoid, and that is never a good combination. He bordered on being a bit crazy, and the idea of someone else being king was enough to make him even crazier. So it's no wonder that all Jerusalem was frightened along with him. But you know, I wonder if Matthew's point in telling us this story isn't to help us understand that we too can be like Herod. We too have a tendency to be filled with Christmas fear when we really understand what this story of the Magi is trying to teach us. You see, we get so wrapped up in being right That we're frightened of the thought of someone else laying claim to truth. I think it's interesting that the Magi couldn't find Jesus by themselves. Now, they needed help from the Jewish religious leaders. And those Jewish religious leaders couldn't find him either without the knowledge that the Magi had been given. You see, neither had a monopoly on the truth. But we're frightened by that, aren't we? We are frightened to think that someone else might be able to help us understand truth. That happens in politics. It happens in science. It happens in economics. Let's face it, it happens in our spiritual lives. We are frightened by the thought of someone else coming into a relationship with God through means that are different from ours. And like Herod, we reach out and in a fit of madness seek to slaughter someone else's experience of faith because it doesn't fit into ours. I see Christmas fear can take hold of us and can make us as crazy as Herod. What Matthew is trying to tell us in this story of the Magi is that with the birth of Jesus, there are no longer insiders and outsiders when it comes to God's love. With the coming of Jesus Christ into the world, God's love and God's grace and God's acceptance are open to everyone. God's truth and love and goodness are not limited by narrow human boundaries that we build. And that's why Matthew tells us that when the Magi found Jesus, they were, as he says, overwhelmed with joy. You see, they didn't just feel a tiny bit of joy. They were overwhelmed with joy. And that epiphany, that revelation, that aha moment can do the same for us. The knowledge that God's love is for all should fill us not with Christmas fear, but with Christmas cheer.